after AgriSol, defining a university's ethics and interests in a corporate world. Who here today has attended Iowa State University? If you did, or if you have someone there now, could you please stand up and remain standing? Who has children that have attended ISU? Please stand also. Anybody that's worked at ISU, please stand up. Anybody that has attended or worked at any publicly funded university, please stand. Anybody that pays taxes or to support a university. And finally, anybody who is concerned about the direction that our universities in this state and this country are taking, please also stand. So take a second, look around, see who's standing. And you can see that we're all connected to this conversation that we're about to have today. That is why we are here. You can sit down. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to take a second to begin by sharing with you the Occupy AIM Statement of Purpose. And this is a shortened version. If you want the long version, it's out on the information table. And this was developed by our group as a consensus. Occupy AIMS is a group of citizens acting non-violently in solidarity with Occupy Wall Street and Occupy movements everywhere. We are a grassroots movement acting in an effort to empower the 99% to take ownership of our political and economic system. We are not a political party, nor are we affiliated with any political party. We believe that a fair and just world is possible, and we are striving to achieve it. Today's teach-in will take a two-panel format. We'll start with an overview of the AgriSol ISU partnership, followed by presentations from the four members of Panel A, speaking about the land grant mission, funding, and corporate influence. After the fourth panelist finishes, there will be a question period. The second part of the teach-in will be with Panel B, and will feature our final three speakers discussing agricultural models, impacts, and new visions. After the last speaker of Panel B, there will be another question period. All of our audience members should have been handed cards when you came in. If you didn't get one, put up your hand if you want them. Okay, we have two volunteers, Victoria and Tomoko, who will come and hand them to you. If you choose not to speak at a microphone but want your question answered, pass your card to either Tomoko or Victoria, and they will bring it to the front, and you can do that at any time. Just raise your hand. For those coming to the mic, we would appreciate if you began by stating at least your first name. We encourage people to ask questions, of course, but we do remind you that our time is limited, especially since our mic didn't work here. So that we ask that you formulate and put your questions forth within about a minute, because we are limited. The purpose of this teach-in is so that we can learn from each other, so that we really would appreciate civil discourse. I would like to introduce briefly the members of our first panel, and please hold your applause till the end. Giving the overview is Ed Fallon, if you would mind standing. Ed served as a member of the Iowa General Assembly from 1993 to 2006. Since 2009, he's been the host of the Fallon Forum, a radio talk show on 98.3 WOW-FM, where he leads discussions on contemporary issues affecting Iowans. He's an active member of the Occupy movement in Iowa. Next up, we have Dave Osterberg sitting on the end, the founder and executive director of the Iowa Policy Project. David holds a master's in water resources management and another in agricultural economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's an associate clinical professor in the Department of Occupational and Environmental Health at the University of Iowa. Paul Johnson has served 3 terms in the Iowa State Legislature from 1984 to 1990, and was chief of the Soil Conservation Service at the U.S. Department of Agriculture from 1993 to 97. He also served 2 terms on the National Research Council Board of Agriculture, where he reviewed the NRC report on alternative agriculture and took part in the development of the National Research Initiative Competitive Grants Program. Carolyn Raffensperger is the Executive Director of the Science and Environmental Health Network. As an environmental lawyer, she specializes in the fundamental changes to law and policy necessary for the protection and restoration of public health and the environment. And our 4th and final speaker of panel A is Matt Ohloff. He's the Iowa-based organizer for Food and Water Watch. He was also a rural community organizer with Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, working with communities throughout the state to stop factory farms and pushing for policies to hold factory farms accountable for the damage they do to their neighbors and the environment. I'd like to turn you over. We have 2 able moderators here, Jennifer Vasquez and Jess Mazer, and they will carry on.
All right, if Ed want to come up and we can give a AgriSol 101 introduction.
Do I need to be in front of a mic? Yes. Yeah. Raise it up a little bit. That should work, right? Is that okay? Okay, good. Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. First of all, I'm not an expert on this issue. I think maybe I'm qualified just by virtue of having flapped my lips quite a bit on about 4 or 5 different radio programs. This is an issue that I feel is very important. I'll tell you why in a second. There's been a lot of people who have been trying to make this issue higher profile. And certainly the student organization that organized this, very impressive. You've done a great job at putting this together. I want to recognize the good reporting, meaning fair and balanced, in the literal sense of the word, of the Ames Tribune and the Iowa State Daily, the Des Moines Register as well, and also Dan Rather reports. It's been great to have that national focus on an issue that really is of national significance. And so, you know, why this interests me is there are 4 really important questions that I think come out of this. And one is, what is the role of a publicly funded university in relation to corporate America? And I mean that in the broadest sense. What is the appropriate connection there? And I think we're going to hopefully get some clarity on that as we move through this. And I think that's probably the primary function of the program today. Secondly, related to that, and I think this is a really important question, Iowa State University must answer questions relevant to AgriSol. It has been uninclined to do that, and that must change. This is a publicly funded university, mostly, and they are accountable to the taxpayers, and they need to be clear about what their involvement has been. Even though they have distanced themselves from the project at this point, we have a right to know, the details behind that relationship. And so I for one, am going to continue to hammer away at that, and I know that other people are committed to that as well, and I think that's good. Not talking about it any further will only encourage silence on the part of publicly funded organizations in the future. And that's not healthy for democracy. And the third issue that I think is really important that is raised in this discussion is, what is the appropriate role of U.S. agriculture, especially big U.S. agriculture, in Africa? And you could argue that what we're seeing now, not just in Tanzania but in other places, and not just with AgriSol and U.S. agriculture, but with other countries as well, you could argue we're seeing a new wave of imperialism in Africa, which nearly everybody today will condemn what happened under various European flags back in the 1700s and 1800s. But today is what we're seeing, a new wave of that imperialism, and if so, how do we address that, and what is the appropriate role for agriculture from developed nations in Africa? And the other question related to that is, what is the role of corporate agriculture here in the U.S.? I think that is brought into play in this whole conversation as well. And just a little bit of again, I'm not an expert on this issue, but having talked about it quite a bit on my radio program, which, by the way, the final show on WOW 98.3 is Thursday. I've been replaced by a right-wing talk show host. Imagine that. Anyway, so tune in this week for the final edition of the Fallon Forum. And Thursday will be wide open in terms of conversation. But the, you know, this thing was moving pretty fast. There was very little opposition to this. The Tanzanian government was on board, and there didn't seem to be a lot of willingness to challenge what was happening. Certainly, the small farmers who live in this area didn't have the tools to really challenge it. And so the other entity that I definitely need to make a recognition of is the Oakland Institute. I think without the Oakland Institute and without Anuradha Mittal's leadership in researching this, we probably wouldn't be here today. So they played a very important role. And that, again, it kind of began to get people thinking about, does it make sense to take a landmass the size of Polk and Dallas County combined and to turn that into a U.S. Corporate agriculture style farm? And obviously I have my biases. Obviously I have an opinion about this, and I think I can't run away from that. I don't think anybody should, but I also think it's important that we invite people with different perspectives to be a part of the conversation. I've not been able to get Bruce Rastetter on my radio show. I've been able to get not a peep from anybody at Iowa State University, despite repeated efforts, both talking with the dean's office at the College of Ag and with the president's office. The one person I have been able to get on my program is the communications director for AgriSol, a gentleman named Henry Acona. Wonderful guy, beautiful accent, and very, very willing to dialogue, and he articulates his points well. We disagree, but having that conversation is a really, really important first step. You can't try to figure out what to do with a situation like this if the other side's not willing to dialogue. So I want to strongly commend Henry for being willing to twice come on my show, even knowing where I stand on this issue. And even in one case, he was on with a guest who had a very different opinion. So that's encouraged, and hopefully we'll have more of that. But again, the raw background is we're looking at a vast tract of land that was settled by Burundian refugees as much as 40 years ago. They're called refugee camps by some, but really, when you've been in a camp for 40 years, it's a village. And you could be 35 years old, and that's all you know. And there are internal tensions within Tanzania that I don't fully understand. But there are efforts to relocate some of those refugees. And one question I have not been able to get a good answer to is some of that relocation because of interests in trying to turn this land over to AgriSol. That issue is not clear to me. But the truth is, from everything I can gather from people who've been there, that they're doing pretty well. It's certainly a lot better off than when they were being persecuted in Burundi. And it's unclear as to how well they will fare once they are relocated. And it's also pretty unclear what the relationship between the small farmers in the area and AgriSol will be once this vision that Bruce Rastetter has put forth is realized, if it is realized. So there are so many more questions than there are answers right now, and that's why I think it's really, really important that we're doing this, and really important that we continue. The one disagreement I have with the title of this teach-in, After AgriSol. We aren't there yet. We're in the middle of AgriSol. We need to keep this issue, and I think you probably intend that, but I think we need to keep this issue front and center and make it very prominent in the conversation over the course of the next year, or maybe longer. I mean, I don't know what the eventual goal would be. Maybe some of us have different goals, but I think this gives us an opportunity to have a dialogue about what the appropriate role of public universities and U.S. agriculture should be in Africa. The fact that ISU has formally backed out of the project does present a problem to AgriSol, in my opinion, because if you look at the original documents, this was presented as a public-private partnership. Well, that element of the partnership is gone. I hear there are efforts to find another public element, but the fact that a very critical and respected public entity backed out should make a lot of people take a step back and take a closer look at this. So, again, it's really the Tanzanian government. One thing I'd like to do is encourage more dialogue with the government of Tanzania, because I don't quite see. I don't quite have a feel for what their interest is in this. Obviously, it's probably very complicated, like a lot of these political and land-based issues are. But but the clarity is still in the formative stage. I really don't quite see where they want to go with this, and it very well may be that with enough public pressure and again public light shown on this issue, they may change their mind about how they see themselves interacting with AgriSol as well. So again, I hope I've shed a little bit of light on this. There are people out there who know a lot more about this, who have studied it in great detail. But the bottom line is there would be a significant number of people, very poor people, who have been doing reasonably well in their situation, who would be displaced, and their future would be unclear. The impact of a U.S.-style industrial ag model on these 800,000 acres in Tanzania would be unclear, although I think a lot of us have some sense about how well that's worked out here, and we suspect that it wouldn't work out all that well in Tanzania as well. So again, plenty of questions. I'm glad this teaching is happening. You've got a great panel of experts here, all with different perspectives and backgrounds, and I'm sure we have a great selection of audience members with, I mean, this is Ames. There's going to be some questions. So thank you again to the people who've organized this, and I look forward to the dialogue that's about to happen.
Thank you, Ed, for getting us off to a great start. We're just going to go ahead and jump right in with the first panel with David Osterberg.
Yeah, let me speak here because I have slides right behind my head, and it'll be easier to look at just one place rather than back and forth. Let's see if this is working. Yeah, the first picture up there was a guy named Andrew Cannon, who's a researcher for the organization that I'm part of, the Iowa Policy Project. 10 days ago, we put out a report on funding by the state for state universities, like Iowa State University, like my own University of Iowa, and UNI, which we've been hearing more about since they've been cutting all kinds of programs because of the underfunding. My first point, research universities are being forced to search many places for funding because where they used to get funding is no longer coming in at in the area it was. This is 2000, and this is how the state general fund was allocated. The first thing you will notice is 60% of what the Iowa general fund goes to is education. K through 12, community colleges, the regents, and a few other things. This is how it changed over time. And by 2012, you can see the part of that pie that got a whole lot smaller was the regents' universities. You know, there is no piece of that pie for waste, fraud, and abuse, by the way, which everybody wants to cut. So just remember, when somebody tells you, by God, they're going to be a budget cutter, realize they're cutting teachers, they're cutting the state university. They're cutting the future of this state, I believe. People here probably have seen that. That's the big cross that happened a few years ago. If you go back to FY 2000, you see about 66% of the money that came. This is first of all, this is only for education of. It doesn't include the vet school. It doesn't include the College of Medicine. Doesn't include all those kind of things. Well, it doesn't include the research that goes on in these kind of places. So this is where the money used to come from, part from tuition and part from the state, and that changed fundamentally. Fundamentally. I mean, these numbers, when I saw them, when Andrew showed me them, I said, do it again. I can't believe it's quite that bad. It is that bad. Here's another way of looking at how bad it is, and these are put together with the right kind of colors, black and gold versus the we did that correctly, and the amount of money seems interesting, doesn't it? Over time, you are kind of moving up, and then we have a bad time. That's the first problem we had. In fact, if you look at the grayish area, that's when we had downturns in the economy. And when you have downturns in the economy, less money comes in, and consequently there should be some kind of response. The response often is cut back at the universities. But what's gone on recently, it goes beyond that. way beyond that. And so if you look at this year right here, FY12, and you kind of go back in time, you go all the way back to 1996 to find the same amount of money coming to the University of Iowa or our Iowa State University, back to 2006. Anybody think we haven't had any inflation since 2000, since that period of time, since 1996? Let me do this again with inflation adjusted dollars, and you can see it's been a 40% decrease. Damn it, they're not funding the universities anymore, and consequently, some kind of response is necessary. Now, whether that's AgriSol, you can decide, but some kind of response is necessary. People are looking for funds. First point. My second point, I'm doing very well. I did that in 4 minutes. So my second point, I get 5 minutes on. And this is personal. This is my other job, my job as an associate professor in the College of Public Health. This is the letter that my dean got back in, as you can see, 2006. It's from Coalition to Support Iowa Farmers, which is kind of a made-up group. But what they said is that they didn't like me going out and speaking for CCI, because CCI, you know what they're like. And consequently, they went through with a 4-page letter talking about just what a bad person I was and how bad my research was, da-da-da-da-da. And well, let me show you a couple more slides. This is who signed it. It's every farm group in Iowa saying that I'm a menace to progressive agriculture. Except, I'm sorry. Except us. Farmers Union did not sign that. Thank you very much, Chris. But let me move back just one more slide because it's interesting. I mean, you send a letter to a dean and say, you've got a problem, professor, and you should do something about it. You don't just say that, you also threaten a little bit. 2006 is when the Iowa College Public Health had a $22 million appropriation sitting in the legislature for a brand new building. So what they said about that was, in addition, Mr. Osterberg's position of authority carries added responsibility to be fair and objective. Fair and objective, Ed. As a guest speaker for ICCI, he is representing by default the anti-agricultural positions espoused by the activist group. So if I speak with ICCI, I'm obviously endorsing everything they are doing, apparently. This unfortunately sends a clear message to Iowa's farm community that the University of Iowa is actively working against the industry's current and future viability. The university should be working to develop sound science-based solutions to the challenges facing our rural farm communities, not partnering with these kind of people. And then in the next paragraph, they say, midway through there, we should be an atmosphere. What should be an atmosphere of partnership to develop new capacity to improve the quality of life in Iowa through work with an expanded College of Public Health could easily devolve into a conflict. What do you think that means? Okay. Now, that was what my dean got. He asked me for my slides. I sent them. Lots of Iowa State reports in those slides, obviously, because I was trying to appeal to a rural audience. So he then sat us down, me and everybody else who worked in this area in my department. I think there were 6 or 7 of us. And he said, I want to get your input on how I answered this letter. But he said, but first of all, I want to tell you a story. This story may be apocryphal. I'm not sure all the numbers. But Dean Merchant had a dad who was also a dean of veterinary medicine at Iowa State University. He has a long association with this university. So what Jim said is that when his dad was a young assistant professor, he came out with a piece of research that looked at local creameries. At the time, most towns would have their own creamery, and found an association between those creameries that did not pasteurize in those places where zoonotic diseases were not rampant, but at a much higher level. Things like brucellosis that go back and forth, you see. So dairy industry didn't like this. They wanted something to be done with Jim's dad, and this was not the dean, but this was the president of Iowa State University who sat Jim's dad down and all these dairy guys and said, I want to hear your research. And Jim's dad explained it. The president had a couple of questions about, did you take into consideration this and that? And when they got done, he looks around and says, seems like a good piece of work to me. This meeting's over. That's what my dean then said was my story. And he then said, well, this meeting's pretty much over because I don't need your input for this letter. I know what I'm going to say, but this is what a dean does. A dean protects people because there are powerful interests out here, and if you think there aren't, wait till you get a letter like this. It's not that the letter happened. That's fine. It's how my dean responded to an obvious threat from some fairly powerful people. You gotta have guts, or otherwise I don't know why you want to be a dean. I hope my present dean I hope she's as good as my former one was, but I think that's probably going to be true. Universities have to be protected. If you're going to find the truth, you can't have a one-way kind of view, and somebody's view who's the most powerful probably is not the best view. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Just a reminder that if you have questions, to write them down, and people will go around and collect them, or just keep them up here for the end of the panel. So now we'll move on to Paul Johnson.
Carolyn Raffensperger.
Can I stay here? Is this all right? Do you hear me?
Yes. That's in third order.
I like to hide behind something when I talk. Well, I hate to follow David Osterberg. For years, we worked together in the Iowa legislature. I'd get up and try to be tough by saying the glass is only half full. He'd come along and say it's 3/4 empty, or something like that. So I'm going to, I don't have quite the story, at least I won't tell that kind of story. But I do want to talk a little bit about where we come from and who we are as a university. Let me start by saying that I see some of you out here even that really ought to be up here speaking. I admire you and the work that you've done over the years. And I've certainly worked with some wonderful people at Iowa State. So let me get that behind right away. But let me start first of all by talking a little bit about land grants and Land Grant University and why we've had such a history, such a wonderful history in many ways. I'll start by borrowing a phrase from Sarah Palin. I bet you didn't expect to hear this today. I suggest we drill, baby, drill. And what I mean by that is drill back into our history and look at the wonderful ideas and the visions that brought us to where we are today. And I think it's important that we do that, and especially at this time. We should have been doing it for the last 50 years, but I think it's extremely important that we talk about where we've come from, what we hoped we would be, and what we've become. And I think it's just really important. We started back in the 1850s and 1860s. There were universities at the time. There was Princeton, and there was Yale, and there was Harvard. But a few people had an idea that maybe we ought to be teaching some practical ideas as well. And so out of that came the idea of the Land Grant University, where you have a good liberal arts education. Education is a central part of an institution, but there's also research and there's extension, and there's the practical side of it. And so the idea of the land grant began back then. And I would argue that in the last 150 years, it has been fantastically successful. In fact, at the end of this last century, and we moved to the one we're in now, I went back to look at all the books about the great things that happened in the 20th century. They didn't even mention agriculture. And yet during that century, we learned to feed each other and to feed the world. The reason we're not is not because we can't do it anymore. The science and the education has just done a miracle in human history. And not, in fact, we have twice as many obese people today as we have hungry people. And the hungry people are not hungry usually because we're unable to feed. So the science and the the education in engineering and in agriculture has been just amazing. So I think that we need to understand that. Unfortunately, I feel that over the last 40 or 50 years, we've kind of lost our way and kind of wondered whether our journey should continue. We maybe feel that we're successful right now and we don't need to take too many more steps. I think this began probably, at least I recall it beginning probably about back in the 1960s when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring. And the agriculture community in particular got extremely defensive. And ever since then, when any new problem arises, our first response is, it's not a problem. Secondly, it's too expensive to fix. And then if we really get down to it, we fix it. But land grants at that time began to become very defensive as well. And when I went to Washington and served as chief of the Soil Conservation Service, one of the first things I did was to put Rachel Carson's picture up on my wall along with my other conservation heroes. And within a day, I was asked to take it down. So I bet there aren't many in the College of Agriculture right now with Rachel Carson's picture up. We're still fighting those fights. And I think it's sad that a university and that an intellectual community cannot be honest and be open and be able to discuss issues like what Rachel Carson raised. By the way, her picture stayed up for the 4 years I was there. I think it probably came down the day I left, I'm not sure. But anyway, we've had a number of things since then. I served in the Iowa legislature, as you know, and David did too, for a number of years back in the 80s. We worked on the Groundwater Protection Act together. And a lot of what we did was to look at agriculture. It wasn't the only cause of groundwater pollution at the time, but certainly it was one. And David will tell you the tensions that developed between our land grant, not between individual faculty members. In fact, I'd often meet with them, usually not in Ames, so that they weren't seen with me. But we talked about these things, and they brought good science to that legislation. And I don't think I'd change many things, and I don't think David would either. At the same time, we started biotechnology, and David and I sort of blew the whistle and suggested that maybe we should have bioethics associated with it. Not to stop it, but to have a good, honest discussion of it in an open and a level playing field where people could come and talk about it. And in the end, our legislature agreed that we ought to put $50,000 a year to it. Iowa State, we said we wanted it in agriculture, the College of Agriculture. Good people at Iowa State said, no, that belongs in religion, since it deals with ethics. And I think we started it in agriculture, and eventually it shifted to ethics, or to religion. But nonetheless, we've had this argument going for a very long time. And so very often in agriculture in particular, our first approach to things is to try to stonewall or to try to quiet things, or to say, to try to prevent us from dealing with them. And I think there is a general feeling today that maybe our mission as a land grant is over. We can feed the world now. We're done. And in closing, I would like to suggest that we're half done and that we have another 150 years to go. And Elder Leopold said it very well, that we've learned to crack the atom and to tame the tide, but we still haven't learned to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, we're sitting right at the bottom of the Des Moines lobe. Many of you are familiar with this land area. It's an area that had hundreds of thousands of miles of drain tile put under it, hundreds of thousands of miles of drain tile under it. It was all swamps. And we put good science and good agriculture to it, and we so radically changed it that I don't think there's been a piece of land like it that's been changed more rapidly and more completely than the Des Moines lobe. And we could look at it and we could say it's the best agriculture in the world. I mean, some people would, and the good science has been brought to it, but only half of it. Biodiversity is gone. Water we're in trouble with. Even our communities are disappearing in the Des Moines lobe. Think of what we could do as a land-grant university if we had a good, open, honest discussion about what this could be. As we re-engineer it and as we put new drain tile in and so on, we re-engineer it with wetlands and we engineer it with more biodiversity in it. And you know, I could talk for a half hour about what we could do, and this is what Iowa State could be doing right now. And so when we think about the land grant in our journey, we don't have to sell off the university to the highest bidder or have a corporate raider take it over and split up parts of it and get rid of rest. Students don't have to become customers. They can still become integral parts of a dialogue that we should have as a great university. I think it's possible. I think it's really up to all of us here, all of us in the state of Iowa to take back this mission and this vision that we had 150 years ago. Justin Morrell said back in the 1850s when he started talking about a land grant is that we needed to build a new type of citizen. And when you think about what they were talking about back then, just think of what our state could be if we recaptured that idea. John Kennedy, and I'll close with this, said we should take on challenges not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Well, we have a good challenge ahead of us, don't we?
Thank you, Paul. Next we have Carolyn Raffensperger.
I'm going to see if I can stand here so I can see you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, we'll move that up and try this. I have a story to tell too. I was sitting on our farm in North Dakota, a much younger woman than I am now, and I made a phone call. And this was when the internet in our farm in North Dakota, was a long-distance dial-up call. And I had looked up the telephone number for Delta and Pineland Company. Now, Delta and Pineland Company was the corporation that had worked as a part of a public-private partnership to create new seeds for agriculture called Terminator technology. These were the suicide seeds that meant a farmer could not save his or her seeds. And they would commit suicide if they weren't sprayed with another chemical or if the farmer tried to save them. And this was in our best interest as farmers. It was actually in the best interest of Delta and Pineland Company, and it had been paid for by your public money and my public money. And I didn't like it. So I got the phone number for Delta and Pineland Company, and I said, "Hi, I'm a North Dakota farm wife, and I want to talk to you about Terminator technology." And I got a vice president of Delta on the phone. And he says, "Well, I'm so glad to hear from you." And I said, "Great, I want my money back." And there was this long silence. And he said, "That's our money." I said, "No, you paid for this partially, but we paid for it as public tax dollars." And he says, "Well, we have a right to make a profit." And I said, "You have a right to make a profit, but not with my money. I want my money back." And he says, "Well, we have to feed the world." I said, "Great, but you don't get to make a profit feeding the world with a suicide technology that means they can't save their seed with my money. I want my money back." And he squeaked a little bit and said, "Well, the problem with feeding the world in the third world is corruption." And I said, "Let me tell you what corruption is. Corruption is making a profit with money that is not yours. Give me my money back." And he said, "I think I agree with you." Now, how did we get into the situation where a farm wife felt threatened by the research funded with her own tax dollars? How did we get into that situation? There's a really good reason, and it comes out of an ethic that emerged out of World War I and World War II. Essentially, what happened with World War II was the university and the government formed a partnership to develop the technology so we could win the war. And it was wildly successful. Iowa State was part of the Manhattan Project. There were lots and lots of things that emerged out of that. And afterwards, Vannevar Bush, who, by the way, was not any of the President Bush's father, I misspoke in another conversation, he wrote a report and he said, "You know,
We need a partnership, not just with the university and with government, but with private industry, so that we can get this out to the public. And the way to do that is to privatize that research. There was an ethic, the idea that this research was good for the public, and we should pay for it. And if we privatized it, if we gave those patents and the intellectual property to companies, then we would get the benefits. Now, we'd get the benefits in two ways. One is by growing the economy. Isn't that wonderful? Growing the economy, the trickle down, our little farm in North Dakota struggling. We were going to be much better off if the corporations had a good balance of trade. If the economy was strong, we would get the benefits of that. And we would get the benefits of the technology. That's an ethic. There was some rationale to it. But I would ask you, has it worked, and what got left out? What got left out? Here's what got left out. That biodiversity, the monarch butterfly, the pollinators that are necessary, the children who are damaged by the nitrates in the groundwater in Iowa. That's who got left out, because nobody gets rich. So what happens? We fund the drugs, the pharmaceuticals, and the agricultural products that make corporations rich, but are not in the public interest. We don't have to do it that way. That was an experiment, and maybe it doesn't work anymore. So, in 1998, January, if you want to look it up, in the magazine put out by AAAS, the magazine called Science, the then president of AAAS wrote an article and gave her speech calling for a new social contract for science. And she said, you know, science has done what we asked it to do. We've cured infectious diseases. We have explored new territories. We've gone to the moon. Science did what we asked of it. But we have a new challenge ahead. On a human-dominated planet where we have altered so many of the basic geochemical cycles of the world, and now we see climate change, where we've polluted almost 100% of the surface water in Iowa. I believe it's 100% of the surface water. We have new challenges. Now we need to devote that great intellect at places like Iowa State University to the challenges ahead, and we need a new social contract. What would that be? What if we had that new social contract here in Iowa? What would we want our scientists to do? Now, David Osterberg pointed out that the funding has decreased. That's because corporations stepped up to the plate and they funded the part of the research agenda that was in their best interest, or part of it. It's why they think that they have some ownership of the research agenda, because we said we wanted them to do that. We said we did. But it's failed because of all the things that we've left out. We don't research new antibiotics, because if I only take one every 2 weeks for 2 weeks every 10 years, it's not quite like the statins that you go on for the rest of your life. So if I'm going to be at Iowa State University investigating in a new pharmaceutical, I want a statin equivalent, right? Not the antibiotic that's going to save your life in a crisis. We need a new social contract for science, and we need to set a public interest research agenda, and then we need to take our side of that bargain and fund it. And we can do that. And we have new models for research. We don't have to have corporate public partnerships anymore. In the Northern Plains, there are marvelous experiments in open source biology, where farmers and scientists are breeding seeds for organic farms, bred for those niches up in the Great Plains, which are very different than Iowa. How wonderful that we could do something like that. My farmers are sitting right here in front of me, Mustard Seed Farm. New models for how we feed each other, how we share, how we build community sufficiency, not self-sufficiency. I ate food from their hands and the gifts of the earth last night, as did my husband. What a gift that you are models for how we can do this. You know, I would call for a new vision for what agriculture should be. I'm an anthropologist and an archaeologist by training. It doesn't say that in my bio. But in my view of culture as an anthropologist, culture's role is to regulate our behavior with each other. You know, I don't sneeze in your face. I shake hands with my right hand. I wash my hands after I go to the bathroom and before I cook, right? So we have culture that tells us how to do these things. And so we also have culture, and for all successful cultures, have had ways of regulating human behavior with the natural world. The kinds of things that Paul was discussing earlier. But our culture does not regulate our behavior with the natural world. It regulates our behavior with technology. Whether it's doctors or whether it's farmers, we regulate our behavior with technology. So our initiation rights are getting a driver's license. You know, what we talk about in terms of technology has to do with new computers, things like that. We are not talking about right relationships with the earth. And so Iowa State, supposedly driving agriculture, is driving our relationships with technology, not with this great, sweet earth that sustains us. A morally mature culture will do that. A university devoted to wisdom will establish a public interest research agenda, will look at how we support the commons with that research, and will lead to moral maturity, which means that we will know how to treat each other with respect and kindness, and that we will know how to treat this earth with respect and kindness. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Matt will be next.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? So my name is Matt Ohloff. I'm with a national nonprofit consumer advocacy organization called Food and Water Watch. Essentially, our mission is to fight against the corporate control of our food and water resources and fight to defend and protect our food and water resources. So I'm also not an expert on land-grant institutions. A lot of the organizing that I do is to fight the corporate control of our food system. Right now we have a handful of corporations which can essentially control all the links of the food chain in our food system, to the detriment of family farmers, to the detriment of the environment, and to the detriment of consumers. The reason why I'm up here talking today is Food and Water Watch, we're set to release a report about kind of the national trends of how land-grant institutions have more recently catered towards the interest of agribusiness, of corporate agribusiness, and how this funding and the compromising of the land-grant public interest mission in agricultural research has impacted public policy. Adam's going to talk a little bit about some state legislation. Carolyn talked well about genetically engineered foods, and our report starts 150 years ago in 1862, and talking about the things that Paul talked about, how great land-grant institutions have been in promoting the public interest in agricultural research, has created abundant and safe food supply for American consumers and helped farmers grow more food. Our report also talks about the Bayh-Dole Act, which essentially opened the door with this public-private partnership of public institutions, our land-grant institutions, doing research and then handing that information over to private corporations to make a profit off of it. We think that Congress should reevaluate the Bayh-Dole Act and repeal it. It is not good public policy. It's not policy in the public interest. One of the policies that we work the most on is the Farm Bill, the federal Farm Bill that passes through Congress about every 5 years. It expires the end of this year. Congress has just begun to hold hearings and start to draft the next Farm Bill. There's a number of titles in the Farm Bill, about 15 titles, which cover different aspects. There's a research title in the Farm Bill. And similar to what David said about state funding, federal funding has also stagnated to do research in the public interest. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has historically provided a lot of funding to land-grant institutions to do agricultural research in the public interest. This funding has stagnated, and just like on state funding, industry has taken up a lot of that burden to land-grant institutions. Industry now contributes, our studies show, about a quarter of all funding to land-grant institutions. There's a number of impacts. Like I said, there's public policy implications to the compromising of land-grant institutions. There's a clear funder effect, which we're all aware of professors taking industry money and then doing research that is then in that industry's creating recommendations and conclusions that's in that industry's best interests and will do the best for their profit margins. Then that research, which is then submitted to agricultural journals, is used and submitted in the public policy arena. If let's say a company wants to get a genetically engineered crop deregulated, they will use the professors that they funded to then submit their research to promote the deregulation of this genetically engineered crop. One of the most egregious examples in our report was a Cornell University professor who was a Monsanto consultant and did research on RBGH, the bovine growth hormone, and submitted his research to agricultural journals, and then that research was submitted as RBGH was being deregulated by the FDA. And as we know, European countries have not deregulated RBGH, only the United States. So these are some very concerning problems. And then in the case of Iowa State, there are examples where the entire university is supporting bad public policy on the state level, which Adam will talk about. So we think we have some recommendations coinciding with our report that in the Farm Bill, in the research title, we should increase funding to land-grant institutions and to direct land-grant institutions with that funding to do agricultural research in the public interest. Like I said, FDA or USDA funding has stagnated, and unfortunately a lot of that funding is being used for commodity and industrial agricultural research. So we need to reevaluate that. As far as genetically engineered food goes, Congress should direct land-grant institutions to be able to do public research on genetically engineered foods. One of the things that makes genetically engineered food so controversial is that public research is not being done on the human health impacts, the environmental impacts, what the actual yields are. All this information is coming from industry itself. That land-grant institutions should disclose where funding is coming from. A lot of the information that we acquired about where professors were getting their funding from, we had to obtain through Freedom of Information Act requests, which is very troubling considering it's a public research institution and this was not publicly available. Another issue is that agricultural journals, like I mentioned, these professors that do the research submit their articles to the journals, and there's not good conflict of interest standards. So we believe that all funding sources should be fully disclosed and readily available of the authors and also of the editors. So just wanted to highlight that, and yeah, thanks for listening.
So we're going to open it up for questions, and I guess I just wanted to start by saying that something I got from Ed and the four panelists was very much this focus on the need for the resurgence of dialogue and basically the call for more respect and attention to be paid to the art of dialogue so that we can, as universities, as publics, as corporations, begin to ask these tough questions and have honest conversations about them. And so my first question to kind of get things started is, how do we begin to define what the public interest is, given that we as a culture, as a society, are having such a difficult time having honest conversations?
I'm going to say a number of us, and one other person in this room, Fred Kirschenman, and I, wrote a paper a few years ago defining public interest research. And it might be worth having looking at that particular article. But my assumption about what public interest research is that research that is publicly funded should add to the commons. And that means the common wealth and the common health for present and future generations. So it should not be primarily directed at enriching a private entity. There are enough ways, corporations have enough money to fund their own research and to make a profit. I'm not challenging their right to make a profit, but there are so many problems now in this world that are not going to make a corporation rich. We don't have enough information on the increased causes of learning disabilities in children. And my guess is the increase in funding for K through 12 has to do with the number of more children in special education than there were 30 years ago. We're not doing research on that kind of problem. We're going to do much more research on the new, new biotech products rather than why our kids are suffering the kinds of chronic diseases that we see. Increases in obesity, increases in cardiovascular disease. We're not researching those. We are not researching how to clean up the waters of Iowa. We live in the most damaged state of the Union, and we don't have research as much research dedicated to it as we could. Leopold Center is certainly charged with that because of Paul and David's work. But I think we know what the public interest is. It adds to the commonwealth, the common pool of knowledge, and it helps the general welfare.
One of the things that's concerned me a great deal over the years is the pressure to not have an open conversation about things. We've heard a lot, and I've been blamed by I'm on the more liberal side of politics, about political correctness. There's a reverse political correctness in a land-grant university that essentially says that, no, we don't talk about these issues. Here's where we're going. And if you do, you might be in trouble. And in fact, that's why we're here today, probably, rather than down on the university, is that what's happened to us as an open place of discussion and dialogue? How are we ever going to get to what the public interest is if we can't talk about it? And if we can't bring in people with different ideas? Most of us up here have pretty similar ideas, and yet I've learned 3 or 4 things today that have got me thinking. If one group that thinks they agree with each other learns by talking, and then why in the world can't both sides talk or all sides talk? And I think it's just sad that a great university doesn't seem to allow that to happen. That's maybe where we ought to begin when we think about the public good. So.
Thank you. Oh, do you want to respond also?
Yeah, obviously one of the biggest problems is that certain institutions in our society and our economy have only one goal, and that is to make as much money as they can. And Sam Giancana, the famous mobster, said it best. He says, well, there's no good money, there's no bad money, there's just money. And so if those kind of decisions are made and we have to experience the consequences of that, that's clearly not in public interest. And so there has to be some kind of a check on that kind of unbridled greed. And as Paul points out, if we can't talk about that, and if that's not part of what's considered academic freedom, then we will only get one story out of our universities, and our students will be only taught one kind of thinking. They'll be taught what to think and not how to think.
Thank you. This question is for either David or Paul. What is the most effective or important action we could take to impact the potential process in funding universities with public funds?
Well, obviously the reason that these graphs are up there, and again, if you look back there, that goes back to 1990. You can see what's happened since about 2000 is a decrease in funding. I don't think most people want this to be the answer, but I think most people don't know that this is the answer. And I'm a Democrat, and a small d and a big D. Both. I think that you got to talk to the people who are making the decisions. And you have to tell them you don't like this decision. You don't like the underfunding of this university because it means that Iowa State University students have some of the highest debt when they come out of college. And because we are such a low-wage state, it means they all have to run off to Chicago or Minneapolis to get decent jobs because our jobs tend not to pay as much. It seems that that's a strong argument, and you ought to be making it. But to think that you're done when you learn something, to think that you're done when you listen to something, that's wrong. It's time for action. Go do something.
One of the things we dealt with back with the Groundwater Protection Act was the development of the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. We didn't view that as something that was going to overpower the present trends at Iowa State University. But we did realize that very often it's the marginal dollar that takes you one direction or another. We saw where large corporations were putting in $5,000 for a graduate student. Well, we thought, why can't we be doing that as well? And so in fact, we did that. And one of my favorite readings every year is to get the annual report of the Leopold Center and to look at some of that research that's being funded. It's pretty amazing. Not a whole lot of money is doing a fantastic amount of good. And so I think that that's one way to look at it. That does not take the place of what you see up there on the graphs at all. When we established the Leopold Center, some of us went to see President Gordon Eaton, who was then the president of our university, good scientist, geologist. And we went there because we wanted to impress upon him what this is all about. And some of Iowa State's faculty came with us. And I will never forget that one really very well-known scientist at Iowa State broke down and started to cry in that meeting because finally he was able to have money to do research that he had wanted to do all his life, but was unable to do it. He's gone now. I don't think he would be upset with my saying how strongly he felt about the fact that these marginal dollars made a huge amount of difference in the research that he wanted to do. So we're up against a big challenge.
We have time for one question from the audience, if anyone has one.
Hi, my name's Steve. Thank you all for coming. If the university is going to be partnering in global initiatives, and especially in the global economy, is it unfair to expect that the university would have a clear statement of global ethics and global purpose? Am I totally naive in expecting that the university I've worked for 34 years would have a clear statement of global ethics and global purpose?
I could offer a point of view on that. I would just say that yes, that should happen, and if there ever was an incentive to do so, this situation in Tanzania is a great example. I mean, again, people are universally critical of the imperial role of European powers in colonizing, read raping, Africa 2 centuries ago, and I think if this is studied more carefully, will be seen as a new wave that deserves to be analyzed under the spectrum of ethics. And yeah, it's not just policy; it's ethics. And I think your question's a great one. Let the dialogue begin. Let this be the catalyst for that dialogue.
We actually do approach ethics, but mostly in sound bites. So any technology, I've worked a long time on the precautionary principle, and I can tell you that any resistance to any technology, and it doesn't matter what it is that I oppose healthy babies. I want a sick and dying baby. I want the world to starve if I oppose biotechnology in the Tanzanian experiment. So it's always the sick and dying baby, the starving baby. That's the either or if I oppose your technology, rather than that there might be an alternative and a healthy alternative, and we don't search for those alternatives, much less lay down a statement of ethics that might include a healthy planet.
So glad we're all here. I think we're off to a really great start. We're going to take a 5-minute break. We're going to hold everyone to that, so we'll meet you back here at just after 2:15.
I do. So when's this report coming out?
We don't have a spot.
Can everybody please be seated? We're about to start.
CCDI to the
Yes.
Just colored marker. And they brought back cases and they spread them out.
I'm giving them a lot. It'll be interesting. So you could tell you were coming up from the border when you saw the oil.
Yeah.
That's a good question. How are you? Good to see you. Okay, well, I was just going to mention that I usually have to talk about policy. There's stuff that former legislators in the state senate.
Well, it was Tom Hebert, who was Deputy Undersecretary of Agriculture. This is Clinton. I know. Yeah, I was essentially a sicko like everybody else.
Okay, we're about to start. Please take a seat.
He was my boss. Deputy Secretary, Undersecretary of Agriculture for Conservation and the Environment, Forest Service, and SCS at the time. I did not give up.
Okay, I would like to start by thanking everyone for coming today, and thank you to all of our panelists who gave very generously of their time to prepare and come speak with us here today, and also extend thanks to the organizers, Occupy Ames and Occupy ISU, because without their hard work, this would not have happened. Okay, if you haven't noticed, we have a literature table out here, and we have information on a wide variety of topics for you to take away. And plus, we have 2 petitions that we would love for you to sign. And when you sign them, if you could please be sure not only to sign your name, but your address and your children's name. No, I'm kidding. Just your address and your signature as well, or else it's not a valid petition entry. The first petition that we have is the Move to Amend petition, which calls for a constitutional amendment that will abolish corporate personhood. Guarantee the right to vote and participate, and to have that vote and participation count, and to protect local communities, their economies, and democracies against domination by corporations and other entities like the World Trade Organization and the World Bank. So you'll find that one out on the table. And the second petition that we have out there is a call by Occupy Ames to have Bruce Rastetter, co-founder of AgriSol and President Pro Tem of the ISU Board of Regents, censured by Governor Branstad. We'd like to have him censured on the grounds of gross conflict of interest for his involvement in the partnership between AgriSol, ISU, and the government of Tanzania. And you will find those petitions out there on the table. Please be sure to sign them. If you have a program, you'll also notice on the front of the program that we have a blog. It's after AgriSol occupyteachin.blogspot.com. And you can also, there will be an archived live stream of this panel if you want to see that, plus just tons of literature relating to today's topics. I would like to introduce the final 3 members of our panel. Speaking first will be Adam Mason in the red shirt there. He spearheads the political work from the State House to the voting booth of the Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, known as ICCI, you've heard that. He organizes staff and members so the ICCI's voter engagement and the mobilization strategies are forceful and effective, and he's been with the Iowa CCI since 2006. Our second speaker will be George Naylor, past president of the Family Farm Coalition. George has raised corn and soybeans on his farm near Churdan, Iowa for 35 years. He was a member of the first Corn Promotion Board and has been an active member for a number of years with the Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement. And then finally, we will close with organic dairy farmer, scientist, and educator, Francis Thicke. After completing his PhD in agronomy, he worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. He served as the National Program Leader for Soil Science for the USDA Extension Service on the Iowa Environmental Protection Commission. Holy mackerel, that was a lot to say. The Iowa Food Policy Council and the Iowa Organic Standards Board. He owns and operates with his wife 80-cow grass-based organic dairy farm near Fairfield, Iowa. And again, there will be a question and answer part after the panelists have finished if you want to forward your questions, and then we'll also take from the mic. So please, civil discourse again. Thank you. Jess?
All right, we're going to start with Adam Mason. Go ahead.
All right, well, I'm here to talk about policy impacts. And by the way, we've got 3 former legislators that we've already heard from, and a state senator that was in the room. I think he had to just leave. So I'm in good company. I think one of them should be talking about this, but I'm happy to do it. I want to take you back real quick. We're going to dig in on one very specific policy. Folks, think back to 2006, November 2006. There was a national tide of change, right? Both at the national level and here in the state of Iowa, Democrats took back Congress, and they took back state houses across the country, and it happened here in Iowa. So 2007, progressive groups across the country, including here in Iowa, from labor, from education, from health and human services, grassroots community groups, we all had our laundry list of legislative agendas that we were going to win. And we did it, right? No. Okay. Well, we were on the offensive at least. We were out there fighting for the policies we wanted, fighting for local control, fighting for collective bargaining, fighting for clean water, clean air, and healthy rural communities. But it didn't take long for our opposition to reset. And here in Iowa, that happened very quickly. You know, we didn't win anything concrete in 2007 out of that legislative session. In 2008, though, because of the pressure we raised and the groundswell of momentum around our issues, we saw the commodity groups and a lot of our corporate enemies running scared and looking for new ways to engage us. The way that manifested itself in 2008 in Iowa was the so-called Iowa odor study. Do folks remember that? All right, well, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it real quick. It was a $23 million 5-year study that would have been taxpayer funded, conducted by Iowa State, the Iowa Department of Ag, and the Iowa DNR, Department of Natural Resources, over 5 years. Now, this study, and I don't want to say that I'm against studying. I probably didn't do enough of it in college. I think studies are great, though. We rely on studies from the Iowa Policy Project all the time. But in this case, this was a study that wasn't needed. It was a study that basically would have, over the course of 5 years, handed out odor-reducing technologies to factory farms. Biofilters, manure additives, those kinds of things to reduce odor. Now, is odor the only problem with factory farms? I think we all know that Iowa has lost tens of thousands of family farmers who used to raise livestock because of factory farms and corporate concentration in the agricultural sector. We know that they've ruined our rural communities, they've polluted our air and our water, and devalued our properties. So odor's not the only problem, but it's one of the most notable problems in rural Iowa. So the commodity groups, Farm Bureau, the corporate interests behind this got together and pushed, folks that they had in power through the Department of Ag, through the DNR, and here at Iowa State to come up with this odor study. The great thing about the odor study was it had no tangible results for us. It would have identified which of these odor-reducing technologies worked the best. It would have given them away to these factory farm producers, but it wouldn't have forced policy recommendations or forced compliance by all factory farms at the end of the study. We saw that as a major problem. Now, was this the only study that's ever been proposed or done on odor? No. If you go to Iowa State's website, 2007, Tyson Broiler Ammonia Emission Monitoring Project. 2006, Summary of Air Quality Research and Extension Offices. Partitioning between pit and wall emission streams of deep pit pig finishing facilities. 2006, adding fiber to the diet of laying hens reduces ammonia emissions. 2005, Summary of Air Quality Research and Extension again. 2004, downwind air quality measurements from poultry and livestock facilities. survey monitoring of air quality from bedded swine systems, developing a baseline of air odor control technology used by the Iowa pork producers, 2003. Early results from the Confined Animal Feeding Operations Field Study, 2003. The list goes on quite a ways. This obviously wasn't the first time. But this is one great example of where we see corporate influence playing out, trying to manipulate our public universities into doing their own research. Now, this fits in line with their strategy, with their agenda, right? They want to study because they want to stall. This would have been a 5-year stall tactic. There was a quote from one of the newspapers after this legislation did pass. It did pass, by the way. However, grassroots groups and a coalition of environmental organizations were successful in removing the $23.7 million in funding from the bill. So it was a non-funded study that hasn't been conducted. Passed 66-34 in our Iowa House and 29-17 in our Iowa Senate. Okay. But it basically, what it came down to was that Iowans were faced with yet another bill that stalled any improvements in actually doing something about odor coming from hog factories for another 5 years. It was a handout. It was passing the cost of cleaning up our environment off to everyday folks, stalling regulations and further oversight of our environment. Now, is that in our interests? No. All right. So this is part of their agenda, though, part of the corporate agenda to pass off their cost to us. We see it through cutting education and then allowing them to fund their studies, fund studies at public universities for their own benefit. It also means that as they work to decrease regulations and public oversight of our environment, they pass the cost of cleaning those environmental disasters off to us. Finally, we are also forced to pay the cost of their own studies through policies like research tax credits. Rockwell Collins, John Deere, seed companies that already do research, their primary business is research, gets tax handouts and tax breaks from us, the taxpayer, to do business that they were already going to do anyway. Does that make sense? All right. So why does this all happen? Shout it out. Money. That's right. We've heard it already. And influence. Corporate titans and the people who run these businesses are giving more and more money every year to politicians, to their electoral campaigns, and now to the actual universities themselves, placing them in higher and higher points of influence, whether that's boards and commissions that should serve the public good, such as the regents. You know, we just heard that in 2 years, the president of the Board of Regents will be Bruce Rastetter, who is behind AgriSol Energy, who is behind Hawkeye Energy Holdings, who was behind Heartland Pork. These were all corporate giants in the industries that he was working in, okay? And it's no surprise then that he gave over $160,000 to our governor and was rewarded with a top position. So what are we gonna do? Well, we know what their vision is. We know that they wanna continue to exert their influence to deregulate and to